It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large with Warner Lewis. 60 minutes of smart talk radio with interesting guests from all walks of life begins right now. So sit back and enjoy. And now, from the flight deck, here's your host, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And of course, that means some smart talk radio is in your future, and this segment, absolutely no exception. She hates this title, but she's known as America's sweetheart. And she is Diane Carey. She is a very, very prolific author. 53 books to her credit, New York Times bestseller. Many of them. She has written historical books. She has written books. You know some of them. Star Trek, for sure. 2 movies, of course, based on her works. She's a grandmother. She sails tall ships. She is also an award-winning bagpiper, which direction will this interview go? On which subject, we're not sure, but we will certainly be talking about a brand new novel called Banners, a novel of 1812, Francis Scott Key and the Star-Spangled Banner. And that, with a botched intro, is indeed where we're headed. Diane, how are you, my friend?
I am very well. I didn't know I was anybody's sweetheart except my husband, but that's great. I'd love to be America's sweetheart.
Well, if you're not yet, we're going to start it here. Anyway,
great, a whole new movement.
You have been a prolific author on a variety of subjects. Why the intrigue for Diane Carey on Francis Scott Key?
Well, actually, I was a member of the crew of the Pride of Baltimore, which is a tall ship out of Baltimore, and it's supposedly a replica of one of the privateers. And the privateers were ships that went to war. They were private ships and private captains and privately owned vessels. And the United States declared war on England. Well, we only had 17 ships, and England had 900. So the solution was that President Madison basically hired or gave license to private captains to go out and harass enemy shipping, and those were called privateers, which is the difference between them and pirates, is that they have a note from the president. So this ship in Baltimore is a ship today that goes all over the world and is a wonderful sailing vessel, and I work on these ships, and so I got intrigued with the story of Captain Tom Boyle and the privateers in 1812, and it just occurred to me that it's sad America doesn't know. I mean, these are people and things we should know about. I mean, we don't know how many people out there don't know that this year is the 200th anniversary of the Star-Spangled Banner? How many people don't know that that was during the War of 1812, not during the Revolutionary War? Every 4th of July we celebrate the wrong war. And how many people think that Betsy Ross made that flag? She didn't. It was a lady named Mary Pickersgill, and she lived in Baltimore. She was a widow and running her own business. Women frequently outlived their husbands and ended up running businesses and doing all sorts of things we don't think of them as having done. And she made this gigantic flag. It was 30 feet by 42 feet. It was big enough to cover her house. It is huge. And what's left of it is in the Smithsonian. So I just kind of got fed up with the idea that most Americans don't know this basic stuff, and somehow our kids come out of 12 years of education and have never heard of where the Star-Spangled Banner came from and what the battle was that Francis Scott Key saw and why he wrote this, arguably the most famous battle song in the world. So I figured, okay, you're a writer, so write. Tell the story. So I did.
Why not? Why do you think... You've hung around and done quite a bit of work with historical writing. Why do we still believe what we believe, do you think?
Well, first of all, the War of 1812 was a little bit murky. We don't know. It's a little bit complex, and one of the problems with it was a problem Francis Scott Key had with it. He was against the war. Lots of people were. And the ones who were against it largely were against it because people in Congress were using the war as an excuse to seize Canada, to make it a state. And take can you imagine that, the state of Canada? But that was one of the kind of nefarious reasons that they were declaring war on England. England at the time was fighting Napoleon, and this is something that would echo itself again years later when England stood against Hitler. They were trying to fight Napoleon, who was lopping off giant sections of Europe and taking charge of them, and the United States said, hey, they're fighting over there. Let's make them fight here, and we'll win because they're fighting a bigger enemy over there. And it was kind of a nefarious and political reason to start a war. the other reason was that England was so afraid of Napoleon that they were taking American sailors off American ships and pressing them into the Royal Navy. And, they were seizing American citizens and declaring, look, you have an English name, so we're going to make you an English citizen and you're going to come and defend us. And these people would be taken off their ships and away from their families and never see them again and go live in the Royal Navy. So there were multiple reasons that people wanted to fight, but it was kind of I'd say kind of a dishonorable excuse to start a war. And it changed into something else later.
Diane, going back to the Star-Spangled Banner, we as Americans have a funny sort of love-hate relationship with that song. By hate, I mean it's not one, the lyrics don't easily flow off the tongue. The tune is memorable because we've heard it so much, but probably not one that you would go down the street whistling to yourself. Probably wouldn't go over your head if you couldn't get to sleep. But yet at the same time, it is distinctly American. It is distinctly something that wells tremendous emotion in us. I'm curious, with any of your involvement in music or the people that you talk to, what do you think as critically as a musical piece? How should we look at it?
Well, it was a song that was kind of a theme song at a gentleman's club called the Anacreontic Society, and the song was called To Anacreon in Heaven. So Francis Scott Key knew the song, and he likes the tune. It's an octave and a half. It's almost impossible for your average person to sing, and yet it gives us this building crescendo in this song, and the rise and fall of the music is somehow stirring to us. And then he wrote actually other words to it in the year 1804 for Stephen Decatur's victory in Tripoli, which also is referred to in the Marines hymn. And he just liked the tune, so that's the tune that popped into his mind when he started to write those words as he watched the battle at Fort McHenry going on. And it has this element of rising passion in the music. We can all hear it, we can all feel it, we can't all get to that, those notes. But when we hear somebody sing it, who can sing it, like Whitney Houston or Sandy Patty, these different people, it's absolutely stirring and unforgettable. He wrote 4 stanzas to that song. We only hear the first one. And we hear it a lot. It's arguably the most recognizable battle song in the world, and we really should know its history and why he was driven to write it, given that he was a pacifist, he was against the war, he was a lawyer, he wasn't a soldier, and yet he wrote this wonderful song in tribute to those people fighting at Fort McHenry.
If you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the Flight Deck and Lewis Large Radio, and we are talking to Diane Carey, prolific author, New York Times bestseller, has also written Star Trek novels, also is a grandmother, also is a tall ship sailor, as well as a bagpiper, but specifically we are trying to focus anyway on a brand new novel from Diane called Banners, a novel of 1812, Francis Scott Key and the Star-Spangled Banner. Diane, as you were doing your research, and I know American history is very important to you, were there any really eye-opening revelations to you during your research, or something that really had you started having you think about something completely differently than before?
Yes, and that thing is that at this time, America was on the cusp of an absolute rush of industrial, just an explosion. The Industrial Revolution was on its way, and people were beginning to get into business and to explore, and things were growing so fast. And all of a sudden, in the middle of it, boom, we started a war. And that meant there was a British blockade, and that meant that we couldn't do our trade anymore. We couldn't, we couldn't sell our products. We couldn't buy products. It was a terrible time. And right at this time, when should have been the beginning of this huge explosion of American incentive and things that eventually did come about. The thing that strikes me most is that we almost lost the country in 1812. The English won against Napoleon and then turned their power to us and were going to slap us down for having dared to challenge them, and they darn near won. If it hadn't been for the ships at sea, the privateers, they probably would have won. And what would have happened then? You look at this in the long telescope of time, and tell your kids, if we had not won in 1812, or at least preserved the country, they called it the Second War for American Independence, there would have been no United States to fight Hitler and Mussolini and Hirohito and to stand up against Russia and these other places. And there would be no United States now to stand up against people who would happily take over other people's countries.
Yeah.
That is a major change in the world if you think about what could have been so easily lost.
Yeah, and again, as we mentioned earlier, I'm not convinced at all that the gravity of the situation is really has been given its due.
Not at all. Our kids don't even know. I mean, how can our kids get out of school without having any idea where that song comes from, what the battle was? They hear it all the time. How many times do we hear the Star-Spangled Banner? Do we remember what it was about? Do we understand why we take off our hats and salute the flag? It's important for our kids to know, because we are losing our American identity. People are forgetting in this country why we are Americans and what makes us different. And the thing that makes us different is that Americans rejected powerful government. That was why America was formed, so that the government could do a few basic things and the rest would be left to the people and their own incentive and self-reliance. We're losing our self-reliance, and it's something that is terrible to be lost, and I think it's dangerous. Our children need to know that anybody can be an American anywhere in the world. You can be American of any bloodline. I mean, I should know. I'm an Assyrian that plays bagpipes. I sing Hawaiian music. I do all sorts of things. I do lots of multicultural stuff. I have an adopted Guatemalan son. I am diversity, and what I always say is we must stand on our own 2 feet and not look to the government to tell us how to live. And we're losing that. We're saying, oh, okay, you're going to give us stuff? Well, all right, go ahead, take over my life. It's very dangerous, and we need to teach our kids.
Take us inside now, Banners. Give us the premise. We've got most of the background, but and also, why a novel versus just a pure historical piece?
Well, if you read history of this time, it's very complicated, and it's hard to understand. It took me a long time to kind of sift through and figure out what stories I wanted to tell. And the reason you put something in novel form or in play form or in screenplay form is to show things from the characters' points of view. And one of the important things about writing history is that they didn't know what was going to happen next. We do. But you go back into their minds and you start to look at these situations, and they don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. They don't know whether Washington is going to burn or Baltimore is going to fall. They are scared for their lives. They don't know whether to fight here or fight there. They don't know where the enemy will strike next. They don't know what the future is going to bring. So you take it from their points of view. And from Francis Scott Key's point of view, he was a plantation boy. He was wealthy. He was known by everybody. He was very famous and very low key and very laid back, quiet, troubled sort of a person, and desperate to make his mark in the world, but he didn't know how to do it. So he had no idea that this was going to be. He was going to embody the American identity in this wonderful song he would write someday. Mary Pickersgill was faced with this daunting task of making a gigantic flag that would take 350,000 hand stitches and 1,260 square feet of English bunting. Where was she going to get it? Through the blockade. How could she get her hands on English bunting in the middle of a time when their trade was restricted? And Captain Boyle, Tom Boyle, he was told by the president, go thou and attack. And he took his ships and he went out and was a very successful privateer. What was his motivation for doing that? What did he see was coming next? You know, he took his ship. He got fed up with the blockade. And he took his one ship, the Chasseur, and he sailed over to England, and he stuck a note on Lloyd's of London that said, you are now under blockade by the United States, with one ship. I mean, this is a quintessential American thing to do. He was so ballsy and so, just defiant. And it worked. The insurance rates hit the roof. The England just went into a topsy-turvy, and they came and they attacked Baltimore because that was the place where these ships were being built, these fast privateer ships that England couldn't figure out how to sail. So they came and tried to attack it, and guess what? That was the battle Francis Scott Key saw. So these things are all linked, but to get into the minds of the characters, you have to understand that they don't know what's going to happen. And
right.
They're afraid, and they see the stuff happening around them, and they don't know how it's going to end. And that's a lot different from writing just straight history, here's what happened. Because then you get the emotions, and you get the fears, and you get the arguments between them, and trying to figure out what to do next, and their own inner turmoil. Should I join the militia? Should I do this? Should I do that? Should I move? Should I go west? How much? What is happening in our lives now that we're doing this?
Francis Scott Key is not physically in that geographical location at that moment. Where are
He's not?
Where are we? Where are we?
Oh, he was there. He was
I know
in
that. I know. But let's take it a different way. He's not there. He gets sick. He's laying in a bed somewhere with a virus. Do we have a national anthem?
No. Well, we probably do. It would probably be America.
Okay.
Or God Save America, or one of those. There were a couple that were kind of accepted as the national anthem without being official. But later, Congress did declare that the Star-Spangled Banner would be the national anthem. Because people just loved it. Once it started to circulate and people started to sing it, it just became very popular. One of the first public singings of the song involved, I think, a quartet of black men singing this song in Baltimore. Can you imagine how wonderful that must have sounded?
Take us to this. In your research, when was it declared our national anthem? And is that a congressional power to declare it so?
Yes, and I don't know exactly when that happened.
Well, that's okay, but it was an act of Congress.
It was an act of Congress.
Okay.
I'll look it up.
And what I'm very curious to know is I guess I do care about the date, because how far after the song was written and put together, words and lyrics, or words and music, was it declared such, and was he able to sort of enjoy the spoils in any way, shape, or form of what he had done?
He did know that that his song was becoming famous. He didn't know it was going to be the national anthem. That didn't happen until March 3rd, 1931, believe it or not.
Wow.
Herbert Hoover. It was very popular. He was the guest at many dinners and parties, and he never really mentioned it that much because he was a very humble person.
Yeah.
He could have become president if he'd wanted to, another thing people don't know. All he had to do was say, all right, I'll do it. But he just didn't have it in his personality to do something like that. So when he wrote the song, when he wrote the lyrics, a few days later he took it to his brother-in-law, who was Captain Nicholson and had fought at Fort McHenry. And he said, here, I wrote this for you and all the people at the fort who fought. And he didn't even put his name on it. Captain Nicholson said, well, can I publish this? He said, well, you can publish it, but don't put my name on it because it's not about me. It's about the people who fought. So it was actually published first without his name on it, and the people had to sniff around and find out who had written it.
Wow.
And, he just left it with Nicholson and went home. And Nicholson had it published as a handbill in Baltimore and started handing it out. People started singing it. And it was very definitely an organic, ground-up movement.
Yeah, and in 1812, they certainly weren't downloading it.
No, they weren't downloading it. Everything was physical at that time, which is what the title means, banners. It's not just the Star-Spangled Banner. It's all the flags that Mary Pickersgill was making for the military, for the private homes, for the fleets. That was the only way to communicate over distance in 1812. Think about it. And they didn't know what was happening at the fort until they saw the flag the next morning. They didn't have any idea whether the fort had fallen and Baltimore was going to burn.
Yeah.
So unless they saw the flag, there was no way to communicate. So it's very important. These are things that you understand that people accomplished amazing things in earlier times than ours.
We are, again, with historian Diane Carey, prolific author, writes for the New York Times. Well, was written for a lot of things, but she's a New York Times bestseller. She's a grandmother. We probably will not touch much on that here, although I'm sure it's probably her favorite subject these days. But she's also a bagpiper, so she's well versed indeed. Again, let's talk about, as we start to kind of wind down here a little bit, let's talk about the banner. Why was she the one chosen?
Well, as I said, Mary Pickersgill had a flag-making business.
Right.
And she was the one that the military went to and the private fleets and all these, they went to, they needed a flag. Or they needed a set of alphabet flags, which is how they spelled things out at sea, if you can imagine, running these flags with little letters on them up the stays. And she was asked as just one of the prominent business persons in town. She was a socialite. She was very well known, very popular person, real nice personality, friendly, loved everybody. And they just knew her. So they went to her and said, can you make this enormous flag? And, it's like, in my book, somebody said 30 by 42. She said inches, No, it's feet. Wow. She had to go lay it out in a nearby brewery in the loft because there was no place she could lay the flag out to place the stars and sew the little stripes together. And there's no piece of fabric that's long enough or wide enough to make one of those stripes. So it all had to be pieced together bit by bit. Anybody out there knows how quilting works? This is how it worked. And the stars had to shine on both sides of the blue field, so she had to figure out how to do that. And all these little details, it's an enormous flag. It can only be made out of English bunting because that was the only stuff that was light enough to actually wave without too much weight and still be that big. I mean, it only weighed about 40 pounds, amazingly. And it's in the Smithsonian now. It's a good pilgrimage if you teach your kids or take your kids or tell your kids' teacher to actually take a good look at that flag. And it has the bottom part of it is missing because they chopped off pieces and gave it to veterans and things like that. At the time they didn't really know it was going to turn into something. But the flag is now in the Smithsonian, and they've done a big restoration on it. So we found out a lot about the little details about how the stitching was done. But if you can imagine doing this by hand, 350,000 stitches. And she actually made a second flag. They asked for two. She made a 25-foot flag, which is called the Storm Flag. And that's the flag that flew all night in the raging, slashing storm and the rockets' red glare and the bombs bursting in air. And then in the morning, when the clouds parted and dawn came and the rain stopped, they unfurled the giant flag. And the British fleet saw it, and Francis Scott Key was standing in the British fleet because he was there as a lawyer, not as a soldier. He was trying to negotiate the freedom of another American, and the British wouldn't let him leave because they were going to attack Baltimore. So he happened to be there, and from the British point of view, he saw this gigantic flag unfold over Fort McHenry and wave in the morning sun. And the British were greatly disheartened. It was one of their first losses. They had been pretty much winning up until then, and people were very afraid.
Wow. Listening to that kind of gets your hair on the back of your neck standing up a little bit. The work is Banners, a novel of 1812, Francis Scott Key and the Star-Spangled Banner, written by Diane Carey. It is published by Kohler Books. But Diane, how can people find out more about the work that you do and also specifically get a copy of the work?
Well, I have a website. It's DianeCareyAuthor.com. My name is spelled D-I-A-N-E, the correct way to spell Diane, C-A-R-E-Y, author.com. Or you can pre-order the book on Amazon or any book-selling site. And I'm challenging everybody, please go out there, buy the book, read it, tell your kids, have them read it, and then buy a second one and give it to your kids' school. Because we need to get this in front of our nation's teachers. The reason our kids don't know it is the teachers are never told. And it's such basic, wonderful information. It's easy to read, much easier than reading a historical, accounting, because they can get complex and kind of dry. And the benefit of having it in a novel is you've got people talking to each other and describing things and living out this story, and it was exciting and scary. And as I said, they didn't know how it was going to end. So those are always interesting points of view. But DianeCareyAuthor.com is the website. I hope everybody takes a look at it, and I hope you put it in a school.
Hey, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for the insight. Thanks for piecing all of this together in this great novel called Banners. And would love to talk to you again.
Well, you call me anytime. I love to talk, in case you hadn't noticed.
Okay. Okay. We'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.